is October of 1912. The Tsarevich, Alexei, heir to the Romanov dynasty, lies with a high fever and severe pain in bed, suffering from the effects of a hemorrhage and is close to death. His mother, the Tsaritsa, is beside herself with fear, so she telegrams the one man she feels may be able to save her son, her faith healer. He telegrams back immediately and tells the Tsaritsa, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve, the little one will not die." The very next morning, Alexei starts to recover until finally his bleeding stops, by which time Alexandra is convinced that the man who saved her son's life is now indispensable to the Romanov family, as well as the Russian state. The man's name? Grigori Rasputin. The man known to history as Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin, or Grigori Yefimovich Novak, was born on the 21st of January 1869 in the village of Pokrovska in Siberia. Rasputin was born into a peasant family in one of the most remote regions on the planet and was named after the Eastern Orthodox saint Gregory of Nyssa, whose annual remembrance was held on the same day as Rasputin's baptism, which was the day after his birth. Rasputin's father, Yefim Rasputin, was a farmer and church elder and had been described by many as a stereotypical Siberian peasant, but someone who was philosophically minded and who engaged himself in the events that took place at the turn of the 20th century. Little is known of Rasputin's childhood, although records show that his mother was Anna Rasputin, who gave birth to 8 or possibly 9 children, 5 of whom died in infancy or in adolescence, Grigori Rasputin being the only surviving son of Yefim and Anna to reach adulthood. Rasputin would later go on to be known by unfavorable terms, such as the Mad Monk or the Holy Devil, but he was, nonetheless, a self-proclaimed mystic or prophet who traveled Russia and the Middle East as a religious missionary, after failing to be ordained into the Byzantine Church, instead becoming a stariyet or holy man, offering his own interpretations of the Holy Book and forming a rather large following in the process. Rasputin was educated at a monastery in Verkhoturye, where he trained to be a member of the church, and although there is little information about the first 30 years of his life, much of what is known from this period has come from oral traditions and the collective knowledge of those who knew him. But as he grew to prominence, his life became increasingly well documented and was also closely scrutinized as he mysteriously edged his way into the social circles of the upper class of Russian society. In childhood, Rasputin was given his name by local villagers, which translated as libertine, debauched one, or perhaps licentious. But modern historians have argued that his name simply means where two rivers meet. And growing up, Rasputin was said to be illiterate, which was not uncommon for rural peasants, as it was estimated that only 4% of the population could read and write by the beginning of the 20th century. This was something he would not overcome until adulthood. According to local legend, Rasputin's family had come from a long line of well-known horse thieves, something that was taught as part of the family business, and by the age of 16, Rasputin's reputation for being a gifted horse wrangler reportedly impressed his father, and was a criminal pastime also undertaken by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of Rasputin's later assassins, although these claims are unsubstantiated, according to police records from his childhood town. Rasputin was often involved in committing petty crimes around his village, evidenced not by any official records, but by the reports of those who lived there, and he had no criminal record of any convictions, despite the accusations made against him. But as a child, Rasputin is said to have been a cruel and callous individual, and was considered peculiar in his village, even being imprisoned for 2 days for his conduct towards a district head, who he had accosted at the age of 15. But this was the only official record of any kind of misdemeanor. Although speculation concerning previous wrongdoings are largely unfounded, he was not free from rumors and controversy surrounding his day-to-day life. including public drunkenness, which was a reoccurring theme during his adolescence, and on one occasion he stole vodka from a group of acquaintances, which, if true, would suggest he was unable to control his impulses. Instead of being given regular schooling, peasants would often help their families once they were old enough to do so, and the young Rasputin was no exception, as he was no stranger to manual labor and would fish, farm, herd livestock, and work in the fields to help sustain his family's livelihood. Another rumor which surrounded Rasputin was the idea that he held supernatural powers because of his mysterious ability to identify thieves, including someone who stole horses from his father, although this may have been an intentional deception on his part, or he may simply have been an informant for the authorities, but the belief could equally have been inspired by his bizarre behaviors, as he often found solace in nature, rather than in people, making him a mysterious figure in the eyes of the local villagers. Although he had two siblings who survived into adolescence, Maria and Dmitri, Rasputin was to outlive both of them, the former having drowned in a river, while the latter having died of complications related to pneumonia, and both deaths had a major effect on Rasputin, and the future advisor to the Romanov family would come to name two of his children after Maria and Dmitri, to honor their memory. As an adolescent, Rasputin developed a liking for his father's favorite spirit, vodka, and by the age of 18, he had spent time at the Verkhoturye monastery, which influenced him to later enter the church, but rumors and speculation suggested that he was sent there to pay penance for a crime, possibly petty theft, whilst under the influence of alcohol, although others proposed that he did indeed intend to become a member of the church. Whatever the case, Rasputin was educated whilst at Verkhoturye, where he remained for several months, developing a rudimentary level of reading and writing skills, and despite his efforts to educate himself at this time, Rasputin is said to have joined a banned religious sect known as the Klisti, who were an organization of up to 40,000 people that had been in existence since 1645, and this would be an event in his life which would cause a significant change in Rasputin's disposition. Upon arriving home, it is said that he built a church under his house where he would hold religious ceremonies as a divine leader, and where it was rumored that he had sex with members of his congregation, though such accusations were not founded upon adequate evidence. At the age of 17, Rasputin met his future spouse, a local woman 3 years his senior, named Praskovia Fyodorovna Dubrovina, who was from Abalak, a place he traveled to in the summer of 1886 for the religious feast of the Assumption ceremony, and the couple married only a year later in February of 1887, soon after Rasputin's 18th birthday. Rasputin and Praskovia had 7 children together. Their first child, Dmitri, was born in 1895, yet unfortunate circumstances surrounded the family, with many of their children dying, and only Dmitri, Maria, and Varvara survived into adulthood, while the other children died of illnesses, such as whooping cough or scarlet fever. But despite these tragic events, Praskovia was a devoted wife to Rasputin, even though he often undertook long-lasting absences from the family home. But in spite of her strong commitment, it is suspected Rasputin fathered many illegitimate children. As the word of Rasputin's holy wisdom traveled across Russia, he and his wife would often host his followers at their family home together, where many people would travel to meet the holy man to seek his advice and be in the presence of such a popular figure. In 1897, at the age of 28 years old, Rasputin left the family home to become a full-time religious devotee, becoming a spiritual director called a Staryet. Some believe he did this to avoid being prosecuted for theft, while others suggest he had experienced a religious awakening inspired by a sighting of the Virgin Mary, who appeared to him in a vision, or maybe even a psychotic episode, perhaps due to the stress of a midlife crisis after being married for 10 years prior to leaving the family home. Whatever the case, Rasputin traveled to Mount Athos in Greece and to the Middle East, where he visited the Holy Land in Jerusalem, returning home to Russia from time to time, but only for short periods so he could continue his missionary travels. And in 1903, Rasputin traveled to Kazan, in southwest Russia, where he was welcomed by the locals and viewed as a Staryet, or a wandering holy man, and during his visit to the area, he was accepted by the Seven Lakes Monastery and lived on charitable donations. While in Kazan, he became well known to local bishops, and he caught the attention of the upper class due to his adept ability to recall scripture, and for his original interpretations of the Bible. This won Rasputin a letter of recommendation to the St. Petersburg Theological Seminary, which was led by the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, a place he traveled to in late 1903 or early 1904. Upon arriving in St. Petersburg, Rasputin met with congregation leader Archimandrit Feofan, who accepted him and allowed him to stay in his home, and Rasputin remained as part of the congregation alongside the monastery's practitioners, who coincidentally invited him to significant holy events and ultimately gave him access to the imperial family. At this time, at the turn of the 20th century, Russia was a society in transition, with war against the Japanese having wounded Russia's pride, and the Russian Revolution looming, as the political situation in the country became unstable and people demanded social change, and it was at this time that Rasputin met and became a close advisor to the Romanov family. It was reported that Rasputin was introduced to the imperial family in 1905 by an upper-class admirer, and he first made contact with two of Nicholas's cousins, before later meeting the Tsar himself and the Empress of Russia, Tsaritsa Alexandra, at an event in the Peterhof Palace, also located in St. Petersburg. Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoy to see his wife and family in late 1905, but he did not stay for long, as soon Rasputin decided to travel back to St. Petersburg to meet the Tsar, bearing a gift of a photograph of the Saint of the Ural, Simeon of Verkhaturie, and in July 1906, Rasputin was given the opportunity of an audience with the Tsar, and was well received by the imperial leader, who then invited Rasputin to meet his wife and children in October, which would be the very first encounter between Rasputin and Tsarevich Alexei, who was Nicholas's son and heir apparent to the empire, and many believe that this was the point that Rasputin declared himself a holy healer, perhaps to gain further acclaim from the religious upper classes. On the 25th of August 1906, an assassination attempt was made on Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, in which the Prime Minister was only slightly injured, but his 15-year-old daughter was badly wounded, and his 3-year-old son was also slightly wounded. And following this incident, Stolypin moved into the Winter Palace, and in October 1906, the Tsar requested that Rasputin pay a visit to Stolypin's son. Rasputin saw the wounded child upon the direction of the Tsar, and soon after became the resident medical interventionist and healer for the Tsarevich, Alexei, who unbeknownst to the public, struggled with hemophilia, a medical condition which makes it difficult for blood to clot properly. At this time, the Tsar appointed Rasputin his lampadnik, or lamplighter, and he kept the lamps lit that burned in front of all the religious icons in the palace, and so he had regular access to the palace and the royal family. And by December 1906, Rasputin had become close enough to the royal family to ask a favor of the Tsar, which was that he should be permitted to change his surname to Rasputin Novi, or Rasputin New, and Nicholas granted the request, and the name change was speedily processed, suggesting that the Tsar viewed and treated Rasputin with favor. During the spring of 1907, when Alexei fell ill with an internal hemorrhage due to his medical condition, Rasputin was summoned to help the young boy, and while there, Rasputin appeared to stop the bleeding and ease the boy's pain, which was seen as a difficult or even impossible task. This led the Romanov family, and especially Tsaritsa Alexandra, to believe that Rasputin possessed divine healing powers, which made her place a great deal of trust in a man who was ultimately accepted as a type of visionary, and became the family's faith healer and later an intimate advisor, who was ultimately viewed as a trusted and indispensable figure by the Tsar, whilst some historians suggest that the Tsaritsa had a romantic attachment to Rasputin also. Some believe Rasputin used hypnosis on Alexei, although others believe he prayed with Alexandra and that his presence was calming for her, and the Tsaritsa's friend, Anna Vorubova, was convinced that Rasputin possessed divine powers and was one of Rasputin's staunchest advocates. But whatever means he used to achieve his results, he was not welcomed by many within the Russian government or the press, and he became the focus of much speculation because of his alleged mysterious grip over the imperial family. But it was unlikely that he wielded as much direct power and influence over Nicholas as many believed. Despite the seemingly indispensable nature of the help he gave the royals, Rasputin was seen as having too much power and influence at court, and so he was subsequently accused of spreading false doctrine and participating in questionable relationships with young women by the Tobolsk district politicians and by the ecclesiastical office of the spiritual consistory, an ecclesiastical office in the Russian Orthodox Church, who were his primary public opponents. He evaded reprimand and avoided punishment for his actions by leaving the imperial court for some time, but upon his return in 1908, he lost favor with the upper classes, who were at once curious and suspicious of him. Many alternative religious movements had gained popularity among the city's aristocracy before Rasputin's arrival in St. Petersburg, such as spiritualism and theosophy, and the aristocracy were intensely curious about the supernatural and matters of the occult, but his exclusive relationship with the royals and the impression he had made on them made them envious and suspicious of him, and so he was not widely accepted. It was felt that Rasputin used his status and power to his advantage, accepting bribes and sexual favors from admirers and working hard to expand his influence. He also became a controversial figure, being accused by his enemies of rape as well as religious heresy, and was suspected of exerting undue political influence over the Tsar. And at one point, he was even rumored to be having an affair with the Tsaritsa, but despite his dramatic decline in popularity, he remained in favor with the imperial family, regardless of the smear campaign they believed was being waged against him. Rasputin remained an ever-present figure among the most important individuals at court, and retained his status as a senior advisor to the Romanovs, surviving the press campaign against him, and both Stolypin and Rasputin appeared, at the time, to bring stability to the Tsar's 1906 constitutional concessions, though, by 1910, Stolypin investigated the Romanov family's faithful advisor and presented a case to the Tsar in which Rasputin was deemed to be both a problematic individual and a danger to Russian integrity, because of the rumors of sexual promiscuity surrounding him since his years living in Siberia. This, coupled with the newspaper campaign aimed at destroying his reputation, forced the Tsar to exile him because of popular demand, and so a hesitant Nicholas, who had initially rejected the advice of his prime minister, ordered that Rasputin be removed from the city, and in exiling Rasputin, the Tsar had shown that he was able to resist the holy man's alleged famous hold over him. In Rasputin's absence, the Tsaritsa begged for him to be allowed to return, yet Nicholas refused to use his executive powers to allow the holy man's return, and during this time, Rasputin traveled to the Middle East once more, arriving in Jerusalem during Easter of 1911, but his absence from Russia was to be only temporary, and he was once again asked to return by none other than the Tsaritsa herself. In September of 1912, Alexei was involved in a boating incident which caused a hematoma to form on his leg, and which caused further complications during an outing with his family 1 month later, when the clot in his thigh and groin hemorrhaged, after a carriage ride near the royal hunting grounds at Spala, causing a delirious fever and severe pain. And the Cesarevich appeared to be close to death, and so as a last resort, the Tsaritsa asked Voruvaba to send a telegram to Siberia to contact Rasputin to ask him to pray for Alexei. Rasputin wrote back immediately, telling the Tsaritsa that, quote, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." And the very next morning, Alexei's condition was stable, and Alexandra was so encouraged by the message that she regained hope that Alexei would survive, and Alexei's bleeding stopped the following day, and by the 19th of October, the hematoma had disappeared. The historian Robert K. Massey called Alexei's recovery, quote, "one of the most mysterious episodes of the whole Rasputin legend," and Massey speculated that suggesting that the doctors should not disturb Alexei had helped his recovery by allowing him to rest and so heal himself, or alternatively, that his message may have calmed Alexandra and reduced the stress on Alexei as a result. But Alexandra believed that Rasputin had performed a miracle and decided that he was essential to Alexei's survival. The survival of the Russian Empire's heir was considered to be nothing short of miraculous, and his recovery was credited to Rasputin's divine healing powers, which in turn justified his return in the eyes of the Tsar, cementing his position as a permanent presence in the family's life, and as a reliable and trustworthy individual for the Tsar, the Tsaritsa, as well as their children, with whom he also shared an unusual closeness and fond relationship. As the Romanovs and Rasputin grew closer, Rasputin would frequently meet with the Emperor and his family at the Winter Palace. This did nothing to quell the rumors of Rasputin's controversial actions, and of his supposed relationship with Alexandra, which eventually led the serving Prime Minister, Vladimir Kokovtsov, to appeal to the Tsar to exile Rasputin to Tobolsk, but the Tsar chose to deny his request, and it was reported that Kokovtsov offered Rasputin 200,000 rubles to leave, and promised no further scrutiny from the press regarding his inappropriate relationship with the Tsaritsa. Ultimately, the Tsar dismissed his prime minister in January 1914 for his failure to control the press, who had continued to report on the scandals of Rasputin, and the government's distaste surrounding Rasputin appeared to increase in intensity in 1913, when the Octoberists carried out an investigation into his actions, which once again failed to sway the Tsar, and Rasputin retained his position of power. Although the exact date is disputed, in or around the 12th of July 1914, Rasputin lived through an assassination attempt in his home village of Pokrovskoy, where he was stabbed in the abdomen in an attack carried out by a 33-year-old peasant woman named Tsiyonya Guseva, who labeled him a false prophet and an antichrist, and although he was badly injured, Rasputin survived the ordeal following surgery, but the pain from this attack would remain with him until his death several years later. Guseva was a follower of Iliador, who was a former priest, radical conservative, and anti-Semite, who had at one point been a supporter of Rasputin before denouncing him in 1911 because of the controversy concerning his sexual escapades, and he was one of a group of establishment figures who had attempted to distance the royal family from Rasputin, but when this attempt failed, Iliador was banished from St. Petersburg and was ultimately defrocked, and although Guseva claimed to have acted alone, both the police and Rasputin believed that Iliador had played a role in the attempt on Rasputin's life. But he fled the country before he could be questioned about the assassination attempt, and Guseva was found to be not responsible for her actions by reason of insanity. Later in 1914, Rasputin moved to Gorokhovia Street in St. Petersburg, where it was claimed he had begun practicing religious ceremonies and carrying out rituals he had learned while working with the Klists. He then taught the Klisti tradition to his followers, which deemed it a sin to ask for forgiveness because they felt only God could grant forgiveness, whereas a normal person could only gain a type of forgiveness, usually when participating in sex. The followers of the Klisti sect believed that sexual exhaustion and prolonged debauchery would bring people closer to God, something which was referred to as the Holy Passionlessness Doctrine, and additional descriptions of Rasputin's religious gatherings consisted of offerings of food and drink, with worshippers congregated around the dinner table, and Rasputin as the center of attention, occasionally teaching his own principles about the Bible to his followers. In August 1914 in Russia, the spectre of world politics reared its head when Germany declared war on Russia in support of their ally, Austria-Hungary, following Russia's mobilization of troops in support of Serbia. And Rasputin was opposed to involvement in the war, as he believed that taking part could spell disaster for the country. But despite his efforts to restrain the Tsar from taking part in the war, Russia made the necessary preparations for the fight, and were fully committed to engaging with the Central Powers. Following the loss of a substantial number of troops, Tsar Nicholas decided to take charge of Russia's army in September of 1915, and leaving the Tsaritsa in control of the government. The Tsar attended the front lines, but faced criticism for Russia's losses on the Western Front, which was no doubt due to his lack of experience as a military commander. While Nicholas was on the front lines, Rasputin is said to have taken advantage of the Tsaritsa's position, effectively usurping administrative power as his influence grew within the government, and his powers extended to the appointment of ministerial figures, as well as senior church members, duties normally reserved for an emperor or empress. Rasputin was also suspected of intervening in military strategy, much to the detriment of the fight against the Central Powers in Europe. But although the extent of his influence remains uncertain, the Tsaritsa was most certainly known for her devotion to Rasputin and his ideas. The result of this situation was that Rasputin bore the responsibility for the ministerial changes made by Nicholas, as well as the mounting defeats Russia was suffering in the war, and with interest growing concerning the influence Rasputin had over the Tsaritsa, many believed that the Tsar was in fact controlled by both his wife and Rasputin together, and so both Rasputin and Alexandra became increasingly unpopular, with right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich being the leading voice of the criticisms against Rasputin in particular. According to detectives following Rasputin, in 1915, he allegedly exposed his genitals to a group of female singers, bringing further attention toward his already questionable behavior. But unable to remove Rasputin diplomatically, a conspiracy unfolded to murder the self-proclaimed prophet, an action defended by the would-be assassins, who claimed that by doing so, they would be saving the empire from further scandal. Some of the conspirators involved in the murder were Purishkevich, the Russian aristocratic prince Felix Yusupov, who was the husband of the Tsar's niece and Nicholas's own cousin, the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, and what they had in common was their opposition to the influence and sway that Rasputin held over Alexandra and the Tsar. Rasputin was lured to his death on the pretext that he would be spending an evening with the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich at the Yusupov's Moika Palace, which he would have considered an alluring and extravagant invitation. But on the morning of the 30th of December 1916, Rasputin was murdered by the gathered nobles, although his ultimate killer would never definitely be determined, as those gathered, including the Grand Duke, claimed no knowledge of who killed Rasputin. Yusupov claimed that Rasputin was invited to his home and arrived shortly after midnight, after which he was escorted to the basement of the palace. He was offered tea and cakes, which unknown to him, contained the poison cyanide. After initially turning down the cakes, he later began eating them, but suffered no outward ill effects, even after drinking 3 glasses of Madeira, which had also been laced with the poison, although he did complain of burning pains in his stomach as well as a headache. At around 2:30 a.m., Yusupov left the basement to talk to his fellow conspirators and was given a revolver by Dmitri Pavlovich. He then returned to the basement and told Rasputin, quote, "Better look at the crucifix and say a prayer." He then shot Rasputin twice in the chest, and according to his own testimony, Yusupov fired at the 47-year-old Rasputin, shooting him close to his heart. But this only seemed to subdue the holy man for a short period and made him angry, which caused Rasputin to attack Yusupov, forcing him to flee, but not before shooting Rasputin 4 more times, leaving him for dead. Rasputin died of the gunshot wounds, one of which was to his forehead, but little more is known for sure of the circumstances surrounding his death, although much speculation has surfaced concerning the details of what happened that fateful night. Indeed, the Tsar's eldest daughter, Olga, believed that Rasputin was in fact killed by Pavlovich, who was a professional soldier, although the details of the event have been explained in detail from the perspective of Yusupov in his memoirs, where he offered insight and an oral testimony concerning the death of Russia's most mysterious figure, although this was just one amongst a number of versions of the details surrounding Rasputin's murder. One alternate report says that Rasputin was shot a second time by Purishkevich, following Yusupov's failure to kill him. It has also been claimed that the conspirators went to Rasputin's apartment with Sukhotin dressed in his coat and hat to give the impression that Rasputin had returned home that night, after which Yusupov returned to the Moika Palace to check that Rasputin was dead. But when he arrived, Rasputin jumped up and attacked Yusupov, causing him to flee upstairs, pursued by Rasputin, who reached the courtyard where he was shot by Purishkevich, after which he collapsed into the snow and his body was wrapped in cloth and then placed in the Malaya Nevka River through a hole bored in the iced-over river. Many theories surround the poisoning that took place, with some suggesting he had developed immunity through the microdosing of poison he was given following the first attempt on his life, whilst others propose that either his alcoholism or his gut prevented his stomach acid from fully absorbing the lethal hydrogen cyanide. Moreover, it has been postulated that the assassins were grossly incompetent, and that the killer or killers had given Rasputin an old batch of poison or accidentally gave him an antidote along with the poison. Although Prince Yusupov's version of events have been widely discredited as false, nonetheless he offers an important narrative of the events because of his implication in Rasputin's killing. Furthermore, testimony supplied by Rasputin's daughter Maria conflicts with these events, as she claims that her father had a dislike for sweet things, and that it was unlikely he would ever have consumed the poisoned food. Others have also proposed that the cakes were not poisoned at all, and that the ingredients were switched with a harmless powder at the last moment by a Polish national, Dr. Stanislaw Stylazowicz, who was responsible for preparing the lethal cakes. A story that conflicts with Yusupov's account. But whatever the truth, Rasputin's lifeless body was recovered on January 1st, 1917, with a gunshot wound to the head, and the St. Petersburg authorities declined to investigate the murder because it was viewed as a justifiable act, the judgment being made by senior officials within the police and the government. Rasputin's body was buried the following day in a church that Anna Varuvova had built at Tsarskoye Selo in St. Petersburg, with members of the imperial family in attendance, but none of his family at the actual burial. Following the February Revolution of 1917, the body of Rasputin was exhumed and burned, in order to prevent his burial place from becoming a shrine for would-be worshippers. Nevertheless, some think of Rasputin as a saint, while others believe he was simply demonic and a force for evil in Russia, and as such was detrimental to the fabric of an already vulnerable society. Despite this, the story of Rasputin and his relationship with the Russian royals is still popular today, with many people around the world intrigued by his life, even though many of his contemporaries were suspicious of the mystic man they dubbed a mad monk, and some historians suggest that his actions, which helped to discredit the Tsarist government, led to the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty, which happened a few weeks after he was assassinated. The Russian Empire fell in 1917, when the Tsar was removed by decree of the Duma in the shadow of the rising Bolshevik party, and during his lifetime the self-proclaimed Stariet was subject to a great deal of gossip and rumors, with many depicting him as controlling the Romanov family like a puppet master pulling the strings of the imperial family, which seemed a sensational claim, but was not at all that far-fetched, not least because of his controversial relationship with the Tsaritsa and her inevitable influence over her husband, the Tsar. Rasputin is a truly fascinating figure, who was both uneducated and obscure, whilst also pious, and driven by what he thought was his destiny. Nevertheless, opinions which depict him as the personification of evil are largely subjective, due to the limited evidence there is available. Although one can infer that he manipulated the Romanovs into believing in his divinity, it could be construed that he played on the Tsaritsa's belief in the healing powers of men of the church, something that she and many others believed in prior to the arrival of Rasputin himself, as Alexandra put her faith in a long list of religious health healers, and despite receiving the support of the ruling Romanovs, he is widely thought to have been responsible for causing the end of a 300-year-old dynasty. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, many academics and historians have tried to unearth the true Grigori Rasputin. Some have postulated that Rasputin was a martyr, while many historians have debated whether he was, in fact, a victim of his opponent's political maneuvering to dethrone Nicholas II in order to instigate major political reform. Was Rasputin really a mad monk, or was he simply a well-meaning healer? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.